wilderness is beautiful, but it can also be terrifying. One summer night on the Appalachian Trail, I learned that the hard way. I'll never forget what happened. It's a story that still sends chills down my spine. Back in my mid-20s, in the late 1980s, I was obsessed with hiking and camping. It was my passion, but Rhode Island, my home state, is tiny, about the size of a postage stamp. I quickly ran out of campgrounds to explore. I wanted something more. I wanted to go somewhere wild. I had heard incredible things about the Appalachian Trail. It was a badge of honor for serious hikers. My uncle, on my dad's side, had hiked the entire trail in the 1950s. Every time hiking came up, he would say, "You've got to try it. It's magical out there." He made it sound like a true wilderness waiting to be explored. His stories inspired me. I decided to follow in his footsteps. I couldn't take an entire summer off work like he did, but I planned to hike the southern portion of the trail from Harper's Ferry to Asheville, North Carolina. It would take me 2 weeks to complete the journey. In the summer of 1989, I traveled to Harper's Ferry with my camping gear. I took a bus and a train to get there. After picking up a few last-minute supplies, I stepped onto the Appalachian Trail. It was the beginning of a journey I had dreamed of for years. The first few days were tough. The trail was demanding, and I was exhausted every night. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound, the hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves, kept waking me up. But I reminded myself that this was part of being out in nature. One night, though, everything changed. I woke up suddenly. I heard something rustling in the leaves near my hammock. I froze, trying to listen. Slowly, I shifted in my hammock and looked over my shoulder. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a dark figure standing over me. I could feel my heart pounding. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I realized it wasn't an animal. It was a person. I whispered, "Who's there?" The figure didn't move. They didn't say a word. Panic set in. In one quick motion, I rolled out of my hammock and ran. I didn't stop. I sprinted into the woods, my heart racing, branches scratching my arms and face. Eventually, I stopped to catch my breath. I was terrified, but I knew I had to go back. My gear was still at the camp, and I needed it to continue the hike. I moved carefully, scanning the darkness for any sign of the figure. When I reached my camp, I saw that it was empty. Everything was still there. Nothing was stolen. That terrified me even more. If they weren't there to steal, then what did they want? I quickly packed up my gear and left. I hiked for hours, putting as much distance as possible between me and that spot. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the fear. I kept imagining the figure standing over me in the middle of the night. I felt like I was being watched. To ease my nerves, I bought some fishing line and cans from a small town along the trail. I used them to make tripwires around my camp. If someone approached, the cans would rattle and alert me. One night, the tripwire was triggered. I jumped out of my hammock, knife in hand, ready to defend myself. But it wasn't a person, it was a fox. I laughed nervously, but the fear lingered. A week passed. I was almost 100 miles away from where I first saw the figure. By now, I was sleeping more easily. I thought I was safe. But then I woke up again. This time I couldn't move. My arms were pinned to my sides. The hammock was wrapped tightly around me, pressing into my face. I panicked. I realized something, or someone was dragging the hammock across the forest floor. I screamed. "Let me go." But no one answered. The dragging continued. I thrashed and kicked, but I couldn't break free. My knife was out of reach. Then I remembered my wristwatch. It had a sharp clasp that I had accidentally cut myself on before. It was my only chance. Fumbling in the darkness, I unbuckled the watch. I gripped the sharp clasp and began slicing through the fabric of the hammock. The material slowly gave way. I kept cutting, and finally I tore through it. I burst out of the hammock and ran into the woods. I didn't stop running until I saw a house with its lights on. I banged on the door, screaming for help.
Help me!
A family let me in. They called the sheriff, who came out the next morning. We returned to my camp, but the hammock was gone. There were no signs of the figure or any evidence of what had happened. The sheriff listened to my story but didn't seem convinced. He suggested I might have been imagining things. But I know what I saw. Years later, I told my uncle about the experience. He nodded and said, "There are people in those mountains. They've lived off the grid for generations. They don't follow society's rules." He admitted that he had a few close calls himself. I haven't returned to the Appalachian Trail since that summer. Maybe one day I will. But if I do, I'll go prepared because the trail isn't the only thing out there. The Appalachian Trail is a place of beauty and freedom, where hikers find solace in nature and escape the chaos of daily life. But beneath its serene surface lies a darker side. This is the true story of Randall Smith, a man whose actions forever tainted the trail's tranquility. Randall Smith grew up as an only child in the small town of Pearisburg, Virginia. His mother was remembered as a kind woman who worked in the laundry room of a hospital. However, for reasons no one fully understood, she dressed young Randall in girls' clothing during his early years. The kids at school didn't let him forget it. They teased him mercilessly, calling him names. As he grew older, his classmates described him as a loner and a habitual liar. He would tell wild stories about money he didn't have or adventures he had supposedly been on. His peers started calling him LR, which stood for Lying Randall. Despite his social struggles, Randall found solace in the Appalachian Trail. As a teenager, he would disappear into the woods for days, exploring its hills and forests. It became his escape. After high school, Randall took on odd jobs around Virginia. He loved the freedom these jobs gave him to roam the trail. For most hikers, the Appalachian Trail represents peace. It's a chance to connect with nature and leave behind the noise of modern life. But not all stories from the trail are peaceful. In the spring of 1981, two social workers from Maine, Susan Ramsey and Robert Mountford, decided to hike the trail to raise money for a mental illness charity. Both were 27 years old and passionate about helping others. As they made their way through Appalachia, they befriended another hiker. The three hit it off, but they eventually parted ways, planning to meet up later in Pearisburg, Randall's hometown. When Susan and Robert didn't show up for the planned meeting, their hiker friend grew concerned. He contacted the police to report them missing. Deputy Sheriff Tom Lawson led the search. His team interviewed other hikers, hoping someone had seen the missing couple. Most hadn't, but one group reported seeing a man and a woman near the Wapiti shelter, talking to a strange-looking individual who acted bizarrely. The deputies headed to the shelter. By the time they arrived on May 30th, 1981, Susan and Robert had been missing for 11 days. Inside the shelter, they found a blood stain on one of the floorboards. Alarmed, the deputies expanded their search. In a nearby clearing, they noticed a pile of leaves that looked like it was covering something. When they kicked the leaves aside, they found a sleeping bag. Inside was the body of Susan Ramsey. The next day, with the help of a sniffer dog, they found Robert Mountford's body buried near a tree stump. Robert had been shot in the head with a .22 caliber pistol. Susan had been stabbed multiple times and bludgeoned to death. Both bodies had been dragged from the shelter to their burial spots. Nearby, the deputies found Susan's camera. They hoped the film might contain clues, but the film had been removed. However, they discovered Susan's backpack, which contained a paperback book. When they dusted it for fingerprints, they found prints belonging to someone other than Susan or Robert. The prints matched Randall Smith. The police obtained a search warrant for Randall's home. He wasn't there, but what they found inside was deeply disturbing. Bloody clothes, items belonging to the murdered hikers, and a collection of pornographic materials were scattered throughout the house. They also found hospital instruments that had been fashioned into crude, unsettling toys. Most chillingly, there was a handwritten note. It claimed Randall had been kidnapped and was about to be executed. But analysis revealed the note was written in Randall's handwriting, a clumsy attempt to throw the police off his trail. The hunt for Randall began. Days passed with no sign of him. Authorities searched the Appalachian Trail, but he had vanished. Deputy Sheriff Tom Lawson, exhausted from the search, decided to take a brief vacation with his family in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. In a strange twist of fate, while there, Lawson received a call from his department. A man had been arrested in Myrtle Beach who matched the description of their suspect. Lawson hurried to the scene. The man claimed to have amnesia. He said he couldn't remember his name or how he had ended up in South Carolina. But his body told a different story. He was covered in insect bites, consistent with someone who had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for days. The deputies devised a plan to confirm his identity. They told the man he needed to sign a medical consent form to receive treatment. When he signed the form, he wrote Randall Lee Smith. Randall was extradited to Virginia and charged with first-degree murder. Initially, it seemed he would face the death penalty. However, in a shocking turn of events, he accepted a plea deal. Instead of execution, he received a 30-year sentence. One of the victim's fathers, an Episcopalian minister, had opposed the death penalty and agreed to the plea bargain. Prosecutors also feared the lack of motive in the killings could weaken their case at trial. The reduced sentence outraged the local community. Many believed justice had not been served. Randall served just 15 years before being released in 1996 for good behavior. He returned to Petersburg, where he became a recluse, living with his mother until her death in 2000. Even after her passing, Randall continued to roam the Appalachian Trail. Hikers occasionally reported seeing him, unaware of the dark history he carried. In 2008, Randall left his home for the last time. He packed a few belongings, took his dog, Bo, and disappeared into the woods. A few months later, he encountered two fishermen, Scott Johnston and Sean Farmer, near Brushy Mountain. Introducing himself as Ricky Williams, Randall shared a meal with them. The fisherman noticed his strange behavior but chalked it up to his rough appearance. As Randall prepared to leave, he suddenly pulled out a .22 pistol and opened fire. Scott and Sean were both hit but managed to escape in their truck, bleeding and terrified. Despite their injuries, they found help and survived. Police later apprehended Randall after he crashed a stolen truck. He was taken into custody but died shortly after in jail, reportedly of natural causes. Randall Smith remains one of the darkest figures in Appalachian Trail history. His actions left scars on the trail and its community, a chilling reminder that not all monsters stay hidden in the woods. The Appalachian Trail is a place where hikers find freedom, adventure, and peace. But for one woman, it became a prison. This is the heartbreaking story of Geraldine Largay, who ventured into the wild and never made it back. Geraldine Largay was no stranger to hiking. During the summer of 2013, she decided to take on the Appalachian Trail, documenting her journey in a small black notebook. Her pace earned her the trail name Inchworm, and though she was a slow walker, she covered an impressive distance. By the time her story began, she had already hiked nearly 1,000 miles from Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. Her journey started with her close friend Jane Lee by her side. Geraldine's husband, George, supported them from afar. He drove ahead to arrange care packages, supply pickups, and occasional motel stays for a night of comfort. But on June 30th, everything changed. When they reached New Hampshire, Jane had to leave the hike due to a family emergency. Geraldine insisted on continuing alone. She was determined to finish the trail. Jane later admitted that Geraldine had a poor sense of direction. She had taken wrong turns before and often became flustered when lost. While hiking through Maine, Geraldine made another wrong turn. This time it was catastrophic. She wandered into a remote area so wild that it was used by the state's National Guard for military training. Despite her circumstances, she kept writing in her notebook. Even as her food supply dwindled and hope faded, she documented her struggle. Geraldine left the trail in one of its most rugged sections. The underbrush was thick, and the fir trees were packed tightly together, creating a maze of greenery. A volunteer who worked on trail maintenance described the area. If you step off the trail, even a little, it's hard to see where the path is. You could walk in circles for hours. Geraldine tried to find high ground to get cell phone service. She texted her husband. Lost since yesterday. Off trail 3 or 4 miles. Call police for what to do, please. She sent more messages, including, in some trouble. Got off trail to go to the bathroom. Now lost. But none of the messages went through. Around July 23rd, Geraldine set up her tent in a secluded spot under thick hemlock trees. She placed her tent atop sticks and pine needles, tying a shiny silver blanket between 2 trees in an attempt to attract attention. The canopy was so dense, though, that the blanket couldn't be seen from the air. George, her husband, was expecting to meet her in Wyman Township on July 23rd. When she didn't show up, he immediately reported her missing. The search for Geraldine was extensive. Multiple agencies and volunteers scoured the area using horses and helicopters. Tragically, Geraldine was less than a mile from the trail. Despite the massive search effort, her campsite remained hidden. False leads poured in, further complicating the search. Some people claimed she had been murdered. Others suggested she had fallen into a river or drowned. Psychics called in with visions, but their tips were baseless. One insisted she had broken her ankle. Another claimed Geraldine was alive at a women's shelter in Tennessee. These distractions wasted valuable time and resources. Geraldine continued to write in her notebook as her situation grew more dire. Her final entry showed a remarkable acceptance of her fate. "When you find my body," she wrote, "please call my husband George and my daughter Carrie. It will be the greatest kindness for them to know that I am dead and where you found me, no matter how many years from now." She waited for help that never came. Geraldine survived on her own for nearly a month before succumbing to exposure and starvation. It took 2 years to find her remains. On October 14, 2015, a surveyor working for a logging company stumbled upon her campsite. Geraldine's body was still inside her sleeping bag. Around her were her belongings: a blue and white bandana, a rosary, birthday candles, lighters, dental floss, a sewing kit, and 2 water bottles, one of which still had water in it. Her campsite was tidy, a testament to her resilience and determination. After she was found, Geraldine's family visited the site to honor her memory. They left a white wooden cross with heartfelt messages written in black marker. One message, written in a child's handwriting, read, "I wish you were here." Her story is a tragic reminder of how unforgiving nature can be, even in a country as developed as the United States. Despite the abundance of resources and the nearness of civilization, Geraldine Largay vanished into the wilderness and was lost for years. Hiking in the Appalachian Mountains is an unforgettable experience. The views are stunning, and the serenity of nature is unmatched. But what happens when nature gets a little too close for comfort? This is the story of a hiking trip that turned into one of the most terrifying moments of my life. Hi everyone, my name is Lena. I'm Malay, and a few summers ago, I participated in a summer school program at Virginia Tech University. It wasn't just about studying. There were plenty of extracurricular activities to keep us busy, and I got to know my classmates well through those adventures. One of the highlights was hiking in the Appalachian Mountains. It was breathtaking. I took photos of some of the most stunning views I'd ever seen. Those hills left an indelible mark on me. But I'll never forget my time there for another reason. One day we were taking a break during our hike. We sat on a rocky ledge, eating snacks and drinking water. The bottles didn't stay cold for long in the heat, but it was refreshing nonetheless. I was chatting with my friends, Sol and Gabby, when we heard rustling in the foliage nearby. Our guide whispered, "Don't move. No one move a muscle." His voice was calm but laced with fear. This was the same guide who had been confident and even cocky earlier in the hike. Hearing him sound so scared made my blood turn cold. I froze, following his instructions. My heart pounded as I glanced in the direction of the sound. What emerged from the bushes made me stop breathing. It was a black bear. I was paralyzed with fear. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. It was like my body had turned to stone. The bear was walking toward me. I didn't know much about black bears at the time, but I had heard they had poor eyesight and excellent senses of smell. I realized it must have been attracted to the scent of our snacks. The bear came closer, sniffing the air. Then it stood up on its hind legs. I couldn't believe how tall it was. I had always thought black bears were small compared to grizzlies, but seeing one up close was terrifying. It sniffed at my hijab, its nose just inches from my face. I held my breath, trembling. I knew if I made even the smallest movement, it might attack. After what felt like an eternity, the bear moved on. It walked over to Sol, who had dropped her sandwich in fear. The bear sniffed at the food but ignored it. Then it stood on its hind legs again, sniffing at Sol's face and neck. We didn't dare move or make a sound. Suddenly, the bear lost interest in us. It dropped back onto all fours and wandered back into the woods. As soon as it was gone, we all exhaled in unison. "Thank God," I whispered. None of us could believe what had just happened. We were shaken, but also grateful that the bear wasn't aggressive. Later, our guide explained that black bears are usually not dangerous unless provoked. He said we were lucky it wasn't a grizzly, which are known to be far more aggressive. That encounter left a lasting impression on me. It reminded me of the power and unpredictability of nature. While I'm grateful nothing happened that day, the memory of that bear standing over me will stay with me forever. I still love hiking and exploring the wild, but now I do so with a newfound respect for the creatures that call it home. The Smoky Mountains are known for their beauty, but they're also shrouded in mystery and folklore. What starts as an innocent camping trip can quickly take a terrifying turn. This is the story of how a childhood legend came to life, leaving me more frightened than I'd ever been before. When I was a kid growing up in North Carolina, I was a proud member of the Boy Scouts of America. Some people might find it corny, but I loved it. Those were some of the best times of my childhood. We did it all: fishing, camping, fieldcraft, and community service. It was good, old-fashioned fun. My parents liked it too. It gave them a break from me every now and then. There were no weird or unsavory incidents with my scoutmasters, despite the jokes my friends like to make about the Boy Scouts these days. Everything was wholesome. Well, almost everything. There was one camping trip that still gives me chills to this day. One summer, our troop went on a big camping trip to the Smoky Mountains. For those who don't know, the Smokies are part of the larger Appalachian Mountains. They're home to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which is one of the most visited parks in the country. The name Smokies comes from the natural fog that hangs over the mountaintops. From a distance, it looks like smoke rising from the trees. The fog is caused by organic compounds released by the vegetation. Sorry, I didn't mean to give a science lesson. Let me get to the story. We were having a great time on that trip. Everything was going smoothly until one night. After dinner, we all sat around the campfire, laughing and talking. Then, one of our scoutmasters decided to tell us a creepy campfire story. He said, "Have you ever heard of Spearfinger?" We all shook our heads. "No? Well, let me tell you about her," he said. Spearfinger is part of Cherokee legend. Her name means one with a pointed spear, and it refers to the long, sharp finger on her right hand. She used that finger, our scoutmaster said, to stab her victims and cut out their livers. She ate them raw. He went on to explain that Spearfinger was said to live in the western part of North Carolina, right in the Smoky Mountains where we were camping. Her skin was made of stone, he continued. That made her invulnerable to arrows. Her footsteps sounded like thunder as she walked through the mountains. We stared at him wide-eyed as he told us about her deep, rumbling voice. When she sang, he said. The birds would scatter. That was the warning sign. If you heard her song, it meant she was coming for you. He told us that Spearfinger could take on the appearance of her victims' family members. She could look like your grandmother, he said, or your favorite aunt. She'd trick you into feeling safe. Then he leaned in closer and lowered his voice. She'd stroke your hair to lull you to sleep, he said. And when you closed your eyes, she'd stab you with her pointed finger. Then she'd rip out your liver and eat it. By the time he finished, we were all terrified. Later that night, I lay in my tent, wide awake. My tent mate was already asleep, but I couldn't relax. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured Spearfinger ripping open the tent and stabbing me with her sharp finger. Then, just as I was about to drift off, something happened. A bright light lit up the side of our tent. I froze. My heart started pounding. I whispered, "Hey, wake up." But my tent mate didn't stir. The light got brighter, and then I heard a hissing sound. "What is that?" I whispered to myself. I stared at the shadow of a figure moving outside our tent. "Who's there?" I called out. No one answered. The shadow got closer. Then I saw it. A long, pointed finger rose against the fabric of the tent. I screamed and tore through the front flap of the tent, running as fast as I could. "Spearfinger, she's here. She's going to eat my liver." I shouted. I expected the other kids to scream too. Instead, I heard laughter. I stopped and turned around. That's when I saw one of the other scouts, Devin, bent over in hysterics. He had tied a long stick to his finger and was waving it around, pretending to be Spearfinger. I felt a mix of anger and embarrassment. Devin thought it was hilarious. He waved the stick at me again and made the same hissing sound. Looking back, it's funny now, but at the time I was furious. That camping trip taught me two things. First, never underestimate how far a Boy Scout will go for a prank. Second, some legends have a way of sticking with you. Even now, when I see liver in the grocery store, I think of Spearfinger. And every time I hear the words Smoky Mountains, I remember that night, the night I thought my liver was about to become someone's midnight snack. What if the most terrifying thing lurking in the wilderness wasn't a bear or a storm, but another human being? This true hiking story will keep you on edge till the very last word. I've been hiking the Appalachian Trail for over 30 years now, and I've had plenty of hair-raising encounters I don't care to repeat. I've come face to face with black bears and their cubs, an experience that any seasoned hiker will tell you is like staring death in the face. I've had fishers scrambling up trees next to my tent at night, which was deeply unsettling back when I was young enough for stories of skinwalkers to send chills down my spine. Once I even heard a sickening crack of wood while crossing a log bridge over a rushing river. In that moment, I was convinced I'd drown. But let me tell you, no fear compares to the fear your fellow man can instill in you. The Appalachian wilderness has a peculiar way of seeping into people's minds, bringing out both the best and the worst. I've seen people transformed by the trail. Some become more appreciative of life's simple pleasures, like a warm bed or a good shower. Others, however, seem to lose their humanity entirely. It's like the mountains possess them, consuming whatever goodness is left inside until they're hardly human anymore. I've heard stories of people who couldn't return to their mundane city lives after a long hike and chose to end it all. Worse yet, I've heard tales of hikers losing their minds and attacking others. Though I've never encountered anyone like that directly, I believe I came terrifyingly close once, and that's as close as I ever want to get. It happened back in the late 90s, during a solo hike in the Great Smoky Mountains. I was experienced enough to venture off trail, but still naive enough to think I could beat an approaching storm. I decided to take a shortcut over the hills, hoping it would get me to a hot shower and meal faster. My arrogance landed me in the middle of a torrential downpour. Experienced hikers know that wet feet are worse than a sunburn. They can be deadly. Wet feet lead to rot and fungus, and when you rely on your legs to get you to safety, losing their function is a death sentence. So when the skies opened, I ran for cover. I found a shallow cave set into a rock face, a godsend, or so I thought. I stripped out of my wet clothes, swapped them for dry ones, and settled in. I didn't bother to explore how deep the cave went, not until I was dry and boredom set in. With nothing else to do, I grabbed my flashlight and decided to see what lay further back. The cave narrowed into a small tunnel, one I'd have to crawl through on my hands and knees. Now, I know what you're thinking. Who in their right mind would crawl into a dark, tight space in the middle of nowhere? But my adventurous streak got the better of me. I squeezed through the tunnel and emerged into a small chamber. The first thing I noticed was a filthy bedroll. Smart, I thought. Whoever had stayed here must have been resourceful. But then, I saw the walls covered in scratches. Someone had etched letters and words into every inch of the rock. While I tried to decipher the chaotic scrawls, my flashlight beam hit the floor. Skulls, dozens of them, from animals of all kinds. And then I saw a human skull. My blood ran cold. I told myself it could have been scavenged from an old burial site. But we all know there's another way someone could acquire a human skull. I wasn't about to stick around and find out which way this one came from. Although the rain was still pouring, I bolted out of that cave, preferring to take my chances with the storm rather than wait for whoever had left that bedroll. They clearly hadn't been gone long. I've returned to the Smokies since, but I stick to the trails now. Whenever I meet someone in that area, I always warn them beware of strangers, even the ones who seem kind-hearted. The mountains have a way of changing people, and not always for the better. Imagine playing innocent childhood games at camp, only to discover years later that those games were hiding a terrifying secret. What you learn will haunt you. For a few summers back when I was a kid, I used to go to a summer camp in Shenandoah National Park. The camp is long gone now, which is a real shame because I have so many happy memories of spending a week in the woods with my friends. For the first few years before heading off to sleep, we'd do the usual camp activities, telling stories around the fire or playing flashlight tag. But one year, the counselors introduced us to a game that, looking back, was truly strange. It was called Invisible. The idea was to run back to your cabin and hide, either under the bunk beds or under your sleeping bag on the top bunk, depending on what you were assigned. The counselors would then check each cabin, and the one with the most invisible kids won extra marshmallows or more as a treat. At the time, I thought it was a weird game, but I didn't care much. I loved marshmallows, so I was all in. We didn't play it often enough for anyone to complain, and it did get kind of fun once we got the hang of it. The best part for me was racing back to the cabin. I was one of the fastest kids, so I'd always make it back first, earning plenty of praise from the counselors. Years later, we finally learned why we'd been playing that game, and it was nothing like what we thought. Back then, we had no idea how much danger we were in. It turned out that during that summer, a prisoner had escaped from the RSW regional jail near Front Royal. He had been on the run for days, and the sheriff's deputies figured out that he was hiding somewhere in the park. They knew because food had been disappearing from the nearby campgrounds. The scariest part? This wasn't just any escapee. The man had been arrested for trying to kidnap an elementary school girl, right in front of her chaperone in broad daylight. He didn't care who saw him. When I think back, I can't imagine how the counselors must have felt. They had to keep us safe while waiting for our parents to come pick us up, all without scaring us. The game Invisible was their way of making sure we knew how to hide, just in case. Camp ended early that year. Most of the kids were taken home as soon as their parents could make the trip. I later found out that the counselors hadn't been sleeping for days. They had taken shifts staying up all night, keeping watch over us. Looking back, I remember how disappointed we were when camp ended. We didn't know why and just thought it was bad luck. Our parents didn't tell us the truth at the time, probably because it would have terrified us. But now, knowing what was going on, I can't help but wonder what other moments from our childhoods were just covers for danger we were too young to understand. An exciting hike to explore a ghost town turned into a chilling encounter with something far more sinister. This story will make you think twice before venturing off the beaten path. I'm a huge camping and hiking enthusiast, so one of the holy grails of my hobby has always been the Appalachian Trail. Unfortunately, I've never had the time to dedicate to hiking the entire thing. Instead, my friends and I would visit certain sections of the trail for about a week at a time. We're based in New Jersey, so we crossed Mount Mincy off our list early. The next year, we tackled the section near Anthony's Nose, leading up to Camp Smith. After that, we conquered the 100-mile wilderness in Maine. In 2018, we decided to venture further south. We'd heard great things about the George Washington and Jefferson National Parks' wild sections of the trail with fascinating features like the oldest fire lookout tower in the eastern. But the place I was most excited about was an old ghost town called Lignite. I love exploring ruins and abandoned places. If it weren't for those terrifying urban exploration videos online, I might be even more into it. The idea of visiting an old, ruined town like Lignite was thrilling. But in reality, venturing out there turned out to be one of the worst mistakes we ever made. It's honestly a miracle none of us were seriously hurt. We started our hike near Covington and made our way down into the forest until we hit the trail. From there, we followed it for about 20 miles along winding paths until we reached Lignite. The whole hike took 9 hours. By the time we arrived, we were exhausted. Instead of searching for a more covered campsite, we decided to set up near the ruins and explore them in the morning. There wasn't much to see, just some old foundations and crumbling chimney stacks. Still, it was worth it to snap a few pictures before we moved on. The next morning, after breakfast, my buddy Joey and I decided to take a walk through the ruins. We were still half asleep from the grueling hike the day before. Joey was walking ahead while I followed, taking pictures with my phone. Then I noticed something in the grass, just a few feet in front of Joey. I reached out and grabbed the back of his shirt, stopping him in his tracks. Right there, among the half-dead yellow grass, was a rusted bear trap. At first we were amazed. The thing looked ancient, like it had been there for decades. Joey joked that I'd saved him from nothing and said he would have been impressed if it had actually clamped onto his leg. We made a bet over whether it still worked and tossed some rocks at the trigger mechanism. It took a few tries, but eventually, Joey hit it with a chunk of old brick. The trap snapped shut violently. We both recoiled in horror. The laughter we shared was nervous because it could have been Joey's leg in that trap. Then it hit us. There might be more traps in the area. We carefully made our way back to camp and told the others. Mike didn't believe us until we showed him a picture of the closed trap. That was enough to convince everyone to pack up and move. We hiked about 5 miles west to Barber's Creek, hoping it would be a safer campsite. The creek gave us fresh water, but what we found the next morning proved we weren't alone. We always set aside an area for a bathroom, away from the camp, to stay as hygienic as possible. After dinner, we relaxed around the fire, shared some bourbon Mike had brought, and went to bed. The night was quiet, no strange noises, voices, or movement, just crickets and cicadas. But the next morning, Mike went to the bathroom area and called out to us. His voice was full of fear. "You better come see this," he shouted. I rushed through the trees with the others, thinking he'd found a bear or something worse. When we got there, Mike pointed to the ground. Another rusted bear trap sat in the open. It hadn't been there the day before. Whoever placed it had been banking on one of us stepping on it during a nighttime bathroom trip. That realization chilled us. We quickly packed up and made our way south, carefully watching the ground as we went. Once we reached Newcastle, we reported the traps to the local police. The officer we spoke to thought it was odd that the traps hadn't been hidden under leaves. It was almost like whoever set them wanted us to find them a warning, maybe, or a message. We didn't stay on the trail long after that. Mike wanted to quit the trip altogether, but we decided to take a bus to Petersburg to throw off whoever was following us. We didn't find any more traps or signs of being followed after that, but the damage was done. For days we couldn't sleep. We'd sit around a dead fire, shining flashlights into the woods, scanning for movement. Only when we were sure the danger had passed did we finally relax. Looking back, it's clear that whoever set those traps didn't want us near lignite. The first trap we found wasn't an accident, it was meant to send a message. And we got it loud and clear. Step back in time to the blood-soaked days of early America, where two brothers carved a path of terror that earned them the chilling title of the nation's first serial killers. This story is as dark as it is unforgettable. Although serial killers aren't exclusive to America, the concept has deeply captured the nation's imagination. Some of the most celebrated films detail the exploits of both fictional and real-life killers. Most of America's infamous murderers like Bundy, Gacy, and Dahmer operated during the so-called golden age of serial murder spanning from the early 1970s to the late 1980s. But who were the first serial killers in the United States? To answer that, we must travel back to the 13 original colonies, a time of daily violence and political strife during the War of Independence. This is the story of America's first brutal and bloodthirsty serial killers, the Harp Brothers. Little is known about the early years of Micajah and Wiley Harp, believed to have been born in 1748 and 1750, respectively. They were the sons of Scottish immigrants who settled in Orange County, North Carolina, between 1761 and 1763. Like many Scottish settlers, the Harp family were staunch Calvinist Protestants and loyal to the British Crown. During the Revolutionary War, the Harp brothers attempted to enlist with the American forces but were rejected due to their family's ties to Tory militias. This rejection likely fueled resentment, though some historians believe they intended to act as spies. Instead, they joined predatory loyalist gangs, exploiting wartime lawlessness by committing theft, arson, and murder. The Harps were brutal even by the violent standards of the time. Officially, their gang was called military associators fighting for the crown in exchange for loot. However, they soon became infamous for their savagery. In 1781, after the British defeat at Yorktown, the Harp Brothers fled to seek refuge with the renegade Chickamauga Cherokee in the Appalachian Mountains. From there, they launched revenge raids on American settlements, including a devastating attack on present-day Nashville, Tennessee, in 1782. When the Cherokee village they hid in was destroyed, the Harps began living as outlaws in the forest, stealing from pioneers to survive. Cut off from society, their bitterness festered, driving them to a murderous rampage that made them America's first true serial killers. In 1797, they killed a man named Johnson, seemingly for no reason. They disemboweled him, filled his chest cavity with rocks, and urinated on his body. Forced to flee, they entered Kentucky, where they murdered a traveling salesman and mutilated his body in the same grotesque way. Next, they tortured and killed 2 Maryland travelers simply for speaking against the British. They forced one man to watch as his companion was killed before murdering him as well. Their signature act of stuffing bodies with rocks and urinating on them left no doubt as to who was responsible. Eventually, the Harps were captured and imprisoned in Kentucky. However, they strangled a guard, escaped, and took revenge by murdering the guard's young son. This atrocity prompted Kentucky Governor James Garrard to place a $300 bounty on their heads in 1799. Instead of hiding, the Harps became even more vicious. Mistaking innocent travelers for bounty hunters, they murdered 5 people in 2 separate incidents. They continued killing indiscriminately, leaving behind a trail of bodies across Tennessee and Kentucky. Their victims included farmers, travelers, and even children. The brothers were finally cornered in Muhlenberg County, Kentucky by a posse of nearly 100 men. During the confrontation, Micajah Harp was shot in the leg. Wiley managed to escape, but Micajah was captured and confessed to 20 murders. One man, Moses Stigall, whose family the Harps had slaughtered, took revenge. He beheaded Micajah with a Bowie knife and mounted his head on a tree near his homestead. The area became known as Harp's Head Road. Wiley Harpy joined the Mason Gang, a group of river pirates, but even they found his bloodlust too extreme and expelled him. 4 years later, Wiley was captured and executed in Mississippi. Like his brother, his head was displayed as a warning to others. The Harp Brothers' killing spree lasted nearly 3 decades and claimed as many as 50 lives. Their gruesome story is a chilling reminder of the brutality that shaped early America and the darkness that can lurk within humanity.